It is my pleasure and honor to start the last, but certainly not the least, panel of our conference, where we'll have three speakers and, well, all non-European cultures. We start with Lisa Indraccolo from Tallinn University, and she will inform us about Abyss, Chaos, and Emptiness, a journey to the depth of the Chinese intellectual tradition. I hope she's present, and please go ahead.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me? Good.
Yes.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for having me. Thank you very much, Marco, for this invitation to join the workshop today. I haven't tried my paper, but I've cut it down a little bit, so I hope it's not too long. I will start immediately. So the title of my paper is Abyss, Chaos, and Emptiness, a journey to the depth of the Chinese intellectual tradition. It shouldn't overlap with Fran's paper, I believe, so I hope we can provide today quite a good overview of different concepts for Abyss in the Chinese tradition. So in our Western understanding, the term abyss denotes a multifaceted, polysemic, transhistorical, and cross-cultural concept deeply rooted already in the ancient Greek and Roman traditions that are the core and represent the foundations of what we might call, for the sake of simplicity, European civilization, or better say, civilizations, and intellectual traditions that developed coalesced narratives in their process of identity construction between the 19th and the 20th century. The concept of abyss actually represents the convergence and synthesis of a semantic and semiotic constellation of partially overlapping intellectual phenomena at the center of a complex network of several concomitant disciplinary discourses that are subsumed under and to a certain extent reconciled within such umbrella term. The different meanings the term assumes in different philosophical interpretations of reality, in psychoanalytical discourse, in the arts and aesthetic theory, and in literature and literary studies, a tentative list that does not aim to be fully exhaustive, is deeply entrenched with and inseparable from complex soteriological and metaphysical considerations that necessarily entail questions about the existence of God, the relationship between the individual, the demonic, and the divine, the nature of human nature, the problematization and the reconciliation with the existence of evil. And finally, narratives of atonement, redemption, and salvation. As John Wilson has brilliantly summarized in his study of the post-traumatic self, quote, in the physical realm, an abyss is a deep, seemingly endless chasm of space, which may or may not be bordered, whirling, still, noisy, cacophonous, or silent. Abyss refers to depth and spatial dimensionality, a bottomless gulf, endless deep black hole, unfathomable void, shaft, vault, crevice, cavern, a whirling and descending vortex, and so on. Abyss as a noun is also used synonymously with the word hell and a place of evil darkness to connote primal chaos, the infernal netherlands or perdition and purgatory, the world of sinister forces and depravity. The hell of the abyss also refers to the diabolic, supernatural, wicked, demonic, shadowy, foreboding space, the realm of the damned, unquote. So the abyss is a daunting, intimidating presence that at the same time exercises an almost irresistible allure and force of attraction. It is a breach into a realm often conceived of as a realm of perdition, the underworld, a world of darkness, loneliness, and isolation, belonging to a different dimension of existence that should ultimately remain beyond human grasp, into which those who are brave enough can stare, but it is a threshold that should never be transpassed. In the Chinese tradition, and especially in the classical pre-imperial and early imperial literature, about 6th century before Christ to the 2nd century of the Common Era, on which I will focus in my contribution, there is no exact equivalent that might possibly exhaust the semantic range of one single univocal term with all the multifaceted connotation that abyss entails and evokes in the Western collective imagination. In my analysis today, I will take into consideration and explore with you 3 potentially suitable candidates, the meanings of which can in part, to a certain extent, assume similar connotations as those that we associate with the concept of abyss in our Western understanding. These 3 terms are Shenyuan, abyss, gulf, or gorge, Hundun, primordial chaos, and Wu, nothingness, non-existence, with its relationship with Su, empty, emptiness, the void. As we shall see more in detail below, both number 2 and number 3 are primary concerns and main principles of Taoist thought, though they assume a different role and significance and are not strictly correlated to one another. So shall start with Shenyuan, the abyss. In both classical and modern Chinese, the term most commonly employed to express or translate the equivalent of the word for abyss as a strong hydromorphological connotation and indicates a profound gulf or a river gorge, usually characterized by and associated with the vivid idea of a gushing water source. However, the imagery we associate with it today is not a particularly peaceful one, as a Shenyuan kind of place is often secluded and hard to reach, dimly lit, shrouded in mist or clouds, and imbued with an almost Miltonian romantic aura of awe and fear, evocative of an ominous unquiet quietude, potentially hiding unfathomable mysteries beneath the surface. However, certain layers of meaning that the term has assumed have accrued over time. Classical considerations about abyss are mostly reflections generated by the contemplation of a nature that might potentially be hostile, but only in the measure in which it is an outer natural counterpart, almost an organic extension of the self that mirrors the inner feelings or dispositions, often of the distraught literatus, that might find a good companion to his unsettledness in a contemplation of a powerfully inspiring landscape. Most recently, there have undoubtedly been, at least in part, influences acquired as inevitable consequence of the translation process of Western literary and philosophical terminology into Chinese. Such process happened most pervasively, especially at the turn of the 20th century, when seminal works of the Western, mostly German and Anglo-American literary, poetic, and sociological philosophical traditions finally reached China and when translated into Chinese, at times relying on Japanese intermediate translations. English and German Romanticism and the aesthetics of the sublime play a major role in the poetics, for instance, of Beaumanoir and other members of the modernist new poetry movement, founded in 1917 by Hu Shi, these being 2 of the most influential figures of the intellectual landscape of the 20th century, and in the theoretical foundations of the so-called May 4th movement of 1919, a cultural and political anti-imperialist movement that grew out of student protests in Beijing. This movement would represent a crucial threshold and exert a long-lasting influence on Chinese literature and culture, as it totally subverted and revolutionized what were at the times the accepted crystallized canons of traditional literary composition, reclaiming that new life would be injected into the sclerotic high literature of the time, considered anachronistic, largely obsolete, and inaccessible to larger strata of the population. To accomplish this goal, the young intellectuals of this movement promoted and advocated for the use of the popular vernacular language instead of literary Chinese, and for the appropriation of modern literary genres from the West as part of a broader enterprise of modernization. Classical Chinese literature throughout the ages abounds with the rich and vivid imagery drawn from the natural world, at times producing rather unexpected associations or expressing opposite connotations in respect to those that certain natural elements might assume in the Western tradition. Text in both prose and verse, and across prose and verse belonging to different genres, are constellated with anthropomorphized landscapes, flora and fauna, that evocate and resonate with the author's innermost feelings or voice their opinions in a subtle, indirect way. These are sophisticated rhetorical artifices that are often deliberately employed to indirectly convey the author's moral judgment or voice their dissent. They typically represent embodied metaphors of emotions and states of mind, but also allegories of morally appropriate or depraved and corrupted behavior, or concepts imbued with a deeper meaning. Shenyuan is typically used in an allegorical or metaphorical way in a poetic context to allude to the inscrutable depths of the human mind and soul, and an indissoluble unified entity in Chinese conceptualization of the human body, the so-called heart-mind, or the workings of the most secluded aspects of the psyche. In this connotation, it does appear occasionally also in the pre-modern tradition, but it does not represent a major trope in the pre-imperial and early imperial period, where it is mostly employed with its original meaning of an actual physical gorge or gulf, and not even commonly used as a natural metaphor in literary or philosophical discourse. So we can move on to our next term, Hundun Chaos. So we shall start with a quotation. So Hundun is the primordial chaos at the origin of the whole universe and everything that exists in it, from constellation to the tiniest grain of sand or minuscule form of life. It has a largely positive, or better say neutral, connotation. It is mostly beyond the definitions of good and evil and appears to be mostly neutral or indifferent to the destiny of human beings and human affairs. As Isabelle Robinet has defined it, semantically, the term Hundun is related to several expressions, hardly translatable in Western languages, that indicate the void or a barren and primal immensity. It is also akin to the expression something confused and yet complete, found in the Tao Te Ching, which a text that we will look at in a few minutes, which denotes the state prior to the formation of the word, where nothing is perceptible, but which nevertheless contains a cosmic seed, unquote. So Hundun is the powerful generative force at the center of myths about the creation of the word, preserved and received pre-imperial and early imperial philosophical and even historiographical literature. According to certain sources, and in particular to the Shanghai Jin, according to the Shanghai Jin, the classic of mountains and seas, possibly the most famous bestiary and geographical or pseudo-geographical treatise in the Chinese tradition. It is also a god or deity that assumes the semblance of a cinnabar red headless animal that looks like a sack with 6 legs and 4 wings. And I do have a picture of this funny little creature that we cannot unsee right now. Okay. Somewhat surprisingly, Hundun does not feature prominently in early philosophical texts, as reconstructing and promoting more or less coherent cosmogonic narratives seems to be mostly a concern of Taoism and its sophisticated cosmological system. Hundun is the primigenial cosmogonic and cosmogenic chaos, the undifferentiated, amorphous, scattered gaseous mass that precedes even the moment in which the two complementary supreme divine entities or deities of the Chinese pantheon, heaven and earth, are generated. It is comparable to an ethereal, nebulous, primordial soup that entails in itself all possible things in potency and ignites within itself the process that will eventually result in the creation of the universe. At a certain point, the perfectly self-sufficient entity associated with an infinite, perfectly still darkness, pretty much as our theories about deep space, that is Hundun, starts separating into 2 components, undifferentiated substance matter, zhi, and the pneuma or breath of life that enlivens all living beings. Through this process, Hundun progressively generates from within itself and gives birth to all forms of life, including the cosmos, the cosmic principle of the Tao, matter and pneuma, the supreme deities of heaven and earth, and concomitantly the cosmogonic and cosmogenic principles of yin and yang that proceed to coalesce into and pervade all aspects of these realms, and eventually all living beings, animals and human beings alike. So the Tao is an especially important actor in this process, as it is a particular, already less rarefied manifestation of Hundun. We can tentatively define the Tao as the ultimate principle at the basis of and regulating the universe. The Tao is the way in which things are in and by themselves, by their own nature, and at the same time, it is the principle that makes things be in the way they are, in and by themselves, by their own nature. As we are told in one of the main texts of the Taoist tradition, the Lao Tzu or Tao Te Ching, which you might know in the translation classic of the Way or Tao and the Virtue, we are told that the Tao gives birth to one, one gives birth to two, two gives birth to three, three gives birth to the 10,000 things. Yin and Yang are complementary cosmic and cosmogenetic principles instead, energies or forces, to binary opposite terms that are equally important and of the same crucial value. They need to be perfectly balanced at all times to ensure that everything in the universe, in the natural world, and even within the human body is harmonious and perfectly functioning. Yin represents the shady or dark side of a hill, the feminine principle, and is associated with and represented by a female or woman, darkness, and with what is moist, cold, soft, yielding, or receptive. While Yang is the sunward or sunny side of a hill, the masculine principle, and is associated with male or men, light, and what is dry, hot, hard, and proactive. It must be kept in mind that while the Tao, together with these two complementary principles, are central, especially to the philosophy of Taoism, for their cosmological balance, they are also part of a broader intellectual discourse across and beyond intellectual lineages and traditions in classical Chinese philosophy. And now we can move on to the last term that we are looking at today, that is emptiness. So emptiness or Wu is a cardinal concept that is most often associated with the Taoist tradition and later on to certain sects of Chinese Buddhism, and is closely connected with one of the cardinal attitudes or practices that the Taoist sage or enlightened person should pursue, practice, and put into action. That is, paradoxically, non-action, or more appropriately, effortless action, Wu Wei. It is somewhat inappropriately translated as non-being, which is actually quite misleading, since Wu does not indicate an absence of existence, a void that is totally empty in the way we might think of in the West. It is actually much closer to the representation of apparently empty space in physics, according to which, for instance, a half-empty glass is not really empty because its apparently empty half is filled with air. So it is actually completely full despite our perceptual deception due to the fact that we, of course, cannot actually see here. This is a fundamental principle also in Chinese aesthetics, for instance, and especially in classical Chinese black and white Taoist ink paintings, where portions left untouched are a negative space that is actually part of the representation itself, typically alluding to the sky or bodies of water. The unsaid and the unpainted, as much as silence in music, are actually fundamental part of the composition. So is this form of nothingness, emptiness, or void in the Chinese intellectual tradition. From this perspective, Wu, though being intangible, it is nevertheless intelligible, and we might say that it is indeed a very much concrete and existing form of non-existence. Actually, according to Taoist cosmology, it even precedes existence, as it is from this kind of nothingness that the principle of Tao first emerges, and in which it is rooted, and then everything is created starting from the Tao. As such, Wu is the fundamental complementary counterpart of Yo, being or tangible existence. Together, Wu and Yo represent the cardinal ultimate ontological principles of reality. It is the sage or intellectually enlightened person that can grasp such fundamental structural principles of reality. Such clairvoyance can be achieved through a particular practice of the so-called fasting of the mind, meaning silencing all external noise and any form of disturbance generated by worldly matters that can perturb and steer the heart-mind, pacify one's own internal feelings and emotions, so as to be constantly in control and accomplish a situation of perfect internal calm and unperturbedness, which enables one to acquire a superior sense of discernment and enhance awareness of oneself and the external environment, and to always act consciously while being in full control of oneself. Such superior discernment, clairvoyance, and perception can be achieved through various practices that enable one to reach this ideal situation of internal void or emptiness, shu, such as, for instance, meditation, breath control exercises, sexual practices, gymnastics, and internal alchemy. Finally, and most importantly, to achieve sagehood and this superior level of consciousness, it is necessary to practice non-action, or better say, effortless action. This again does not mean not to act or to rest in idleness, quite the contrary. It actually means acting with, in the way that is constantly respectful of and in perfect accordance with the Tao and its workings, without superimposing one's own will or personal interest, trying to deliberately interrupt or modify the natural flow of things. And now I'm coming to my conclusions. So finally, I've tried to show you today different aspects of the Western conceptualizations of the Western conceptualization of the abyss do exist in the Chinese tradition as well. Through a close analysis of early Chinese philosophical and intellectual trends, it is possible to identify equally refined, sophisticated elaborations of ideas that are also closely associated with and very much part of our own conception of abyss, such as primordial chaos, void, or emptiness and nothingness. The main difference resides ultimately in the lack of properly religious or soteriological underlying discourses, at least until the advent of Buddhism in China, as none of these concepts, not even Hundun, can be properly understood as an actual creator, God, or deity. In the end, the whole cosmogonic and cosmogenic process, as it is described in early Chinese sources, is actually much more similar to a certain extent, and with all the obvious contextual intellectual limits of the time, to our own conceptions of the birth and growth of the universe and the origins of life on Earth. Thank you very much for your attention. I will stop sharing my screen, and then if there are questions, I can go back to it anytime.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very clear talk, and
good. I'm glad
for keeping your time. I think we started 5 minutes late, so we have at least 5 minutes for questions. And please go ahead. Yeah, Marco.
Yes, thank you very much, Lisa. That's very interesting, and I followed everything very clearly, apart from at the very end. So I would like to get a little bit more of an explanation on that. So you said, well, there's not a religious, soteriological dimension, and I can see what you mean compared to the abyss, but it has somehow as well a cosmogonic dimension, right? And so there is a creation in there, but there's no creator. Can you put it like that?
Yeah, I would say that there are more components to creation. There is not just one God that we have to somehow satisfy, or with whose tenets we have to comply. So there are no commandments, and morality is actually very much left to the individual in the Chinese tradition. So also the concept of free will and there's a whole ongoing discourse on human nature, whether it's good or bad, going on in the pre-modern period. But it's never related to a god or to some precepts coming from above. It's usually always a question of becoming a better person, improving oneself. So morality is a very concrete practice that one enacts every day. So there is definitely the idea of creation somehow, but it seems to be almost, it is a natural process, because Hundun does not deliberately decide to create the word. At a certain point, it's like a cell dividing itself up. So it's not a deliberate choice to create the word. It just happens. So there is not a specific direction or goal that Hundun wants to achieve by doing this. It just happens naturally. And so we are created through different stages, and there are different components of Hundun that evolve from this undifferentiated void, abyss, chasm, whatever it is. But there is, to actually have a figure of a creator god, you don't quite have it even in Buddhism, but of course there is a much deeper dimension of reaching enlightenment, Buddhahood. There are religious precepts that one should follow, and instead it is a very much more human enterprise that we engage in when we try to become moral persons, and the same happens here. There is no god that deliberately creates the word. There is a word that creates itself, evolving from this initial mass, gaseous mass that we have at the beginning.
All right, very interesting. Thank you. I'm even wondering somehow, if not also in the Christian conception, or just every religious conception, there's also a similar aspect of that. Maybe, you know, from an older times that has been then somehow integrated as an abyss into those kind of ideas of Genesis. But of course, I cannot judge that. Urmas might know more about that. But yeah, it's very interesting that there are, I mean, I see, in spite of this lack of a deliberate creation by a creator, very strong parallel to the abyss.
Yeah, no, definitely there are parallels in other traditions that might have later integrated what were more mundane or even pagan visions of the creation myth, and there are parallels also with the flood. The flood myth, for instance, is very strong in the early Chinese tradition, and it influences the whole history of China. So there are very strong parallels in the myths of the origins that are mostly preserved in the mythological core, but they also are considered history. So they are preserved, transmitted, recorded, and the first histories that we have also have these mythological parts at the beginning, even, of course, if there are competing narratives of who did what, but there are definitely parallels with other traditions, and that's why, for instance, it goes very well with Jan Hassmann's idea of the axial age, actually.
Thank you. It was very interesting. I wanted to ask how these different voids, or Hundun or Wu, are connected. Do they occur in the same contexts, or do they occur in separate contexts?
I would say they have different functions. So while in English they might somewhat overlap, they are substantially different in Chinese. So they are different, rather different manifestations of our idea of void. And Hundun is really just this black hole before creation somehow. While, for instance, this idea of the kind of void that we create inside ourselves is rather a stillness of the mind that is similar to what is achieved, for instance, in Zen meditation. So there are very different kinds of practices or function, and they really are quite distinct. I would say also, for instance, Shen Yuan that we've seen at the beginning is really not much present. You actually find it, I could find using a search through a database of all received pre-imperial texts. Basically, you have like 6 or 7 occurrences throughout early Chinese literature, and they are mostly all a quotation from the Book of Odes, so one of the Confucian classics, one of these fundamental canonical texts of the tradition, and it's literally means like a gorge. It's the physical landscape kind of thing, and this quotation is used basically as an authoritative source to illustrate certain points, and it's more or less always the same. So it's really not so relevant. It becomes much more relevant, for instance, in modernist poetry, starting at the beginning of the 20th century. Now there is a new modernist revival. So it's very much similar to our understanding of abyss. It's really trying to reproduce the kind of feeling, intellectual dimension. Hundun instead had this very clear role of being this undifferentiated primigenial state from which everything evolves, and it's mostly in Taoist texts, so it's very much related to that tradition, or in mythological accounts of how the world came into being. And instead, like this Wu as void is very much within the philosophical discourse, so to say, with philosophical practices and an understanding of how different, I would say in that case, you would have Wu and Yo, so being and nothingness are part of the creation process. So they are subsumed under the actions of Hundun somehow, but still they have very clear-cut and different kind of tasks within this within this process somehow.
So thank you very much. I'm not sure if we can take one extra short question. Perhaps I have one extra short. Just curious about this shu emptiness, because what you said reminded me quite a lot of this Buddhist conception of shunya or shunyata, which is one of the basic. Is it this concept? Is it this word that is used for the Buddhist concept, and is it also somehow inspired phonetically?
It is actually the word that is used once Buddhist texts are translated into Chinese to translate shunyata. It's exactly so. In Buddhist texts, it's exactly the same. You would find shu meaning exactly shunyata. So that's a very similar kind of quietude of practice of goal that you should achieve as that. So Buddhism arrives in China during the 1st century of the Common Era already, but it really starts to kick in later on, and we start to have especially massive translation of Buddhist text during the late middle to late medieval period, so starting from the 5th to mostly 8th century, and there you really have also the development of properly Chinese Buddhist sects. Buddhism becomes also state-sponsored during certain dynasties in certain periods, and then there is this attempt at really translating massive amounts of Buddhist texts, important Buddhist texts from India. And of course, there is the problem of the terminology, because it's quite different, especially also all Buddhist logic has its own terminology, of course, and shu is exactly the character that has been picked to express shunyata. So that's exactly that.
Great, thanks for the clear answer. Thank you very much.
Yeah.